Welcome to the 7th video in this review of basic Greek morphology based on 12 core patterns. In these videos we're hitting the main points, and further details using this approach can be found in Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek. We now begin our overview of the Greek verbal system, beginning with the indicative of the primary tense forms, namely present, future, and perfect. And in this video we're going to focus in on the present tense form. I'm referring to these as tense forms and not simply tenses because in English the tense is focused on time, and the Greek verb's not related to time in the same way the English verb is. For a brief introduction to some of these issues, see Appendix 5 in Using and Enjoying Biblical Greek. Our first core pattern is the personal endings for the primary tense forms. O, me, blank, sigma, blank, sin, men, te, usi, asi, and then my, psi, tai, muthasis, ntai, with an eta iota subscript as an alternative to the psi ending in the second singular. You see that this one core pattern covers both the omega verbs and the me verbs. In addition to the me ending itself there in the first singular active, me verbs will use the alternative forms in the third singular active and the third plural active, and also the psi ending in the middle passive second singular. That ending is changed in the omega verbs because the sigma drops out and the alpha lengthens and the iota is subscripted. So there's actually a connection between those two forms. So let's see some of the major paradigms with these endings and see how this core pattern helps us pick up the signals in verbs. For each of these paradigms, you should compare the endings on the paradigm with the endings in the core pattern. So here's our basic paradigm for the present, both active and middle passive. Let's review the basic elements in these forms. They have a stem, which is the present tense form, and it's the first principal part. Recall that Greek verbs, like English verbs, have several principal parts for forming the various tense forms. English has 3 principal parts, and some verbs use the same root for all their forms. For example, to study. So you have study, studied, and studied. Other verbs use a modified root, like sing, sang, sung, and other verbs use more than one root, such as to go. So we have go, went, and gone. Greek also has some verbs with roots in all forms, or a modified root, or more than one root, but instead of 3 parts, Greek uses 6 principal parts, and you see them listed there on the screen. So we will review the main signals for each of these as we review the tense forms, and there will be a brief introduction to the patterns in the principal parts at the end of this series of videos. So now back to the elements that are found in this particular paradigm. We saw the stem, and so here are the endings, and you see they're all what we found in the core pattern. And in some of the forms you see that there's a variable vowel connecting the ending to the stem. If the personal ending begins with a mu or a nu, then an omicron is used. And that is true not just for this pattern, but for paradigms in general. Elsewhere, an epsilon is used, though in the second and third singular we have an epsilon iota in this particular paradigm. One of the main variations in the present tense form is found in contract verbs, so let's review their patterns. As you recall, some verbs have stems ending in alpha, epsilon, or omicron, so when the variable vowel is added, it contracts with the vowel stem ending. You see that the alpha contracts have alpha and omega, and the epsilon contracts have epsilon iota and omicron upsilon, and then the omicron contracts have omicron iota and omicron upsilon. If you were learning to write or speak Greek, you would need to learn these forms carefully, but for reading purposes, it's not necessary. Instead, once you've learned the core pattern for primary endings and the core pattern for vowel contraction that we reviewed in the nominal system, you can look over these paradigms and focus on the forms that you think you might not recognize when you see them in a passage. But you notice that most of the endings are clear. One thing to note is that the middle passive second singular eta iota subscript ending has contracted in the alpha and omicron contracts to a form that's the same as the active third singular. So that's a point of confusion for those two paradigms. As we go through the verbal system, there will be other places where the active third singular is the same form as the second singular of the middle or middle passive. We can take the same approach to the me verbs. All the personal endings are clear if you know the core pattern. One thing to note is the way the third singular active form is distinguished from the third plural active in each paradigm. Both use the ending sin, but the plural adds an alpha. And the core pattern covers this because it includes asi, for the third plural. Remember, it was usi or asi. Note also the shift between long and short stem endings in the singulars. One final form for the present indicative is the paradigm of me. Since it has some distinctive features, it's one of the 12 core patterns to learn. We've now reviewed the present tense form in the indicative mood, and as you go through each of these paradigms, notice how the core pattern covers the endings with only a few modifications. So let's try applying this material to some sample passages. For each example, I invite you to pause the video and see if you can recognize the verbs person, number, and voice. Here's our first word. So did you see that the ending is men, and that means it's going to be a first plural active. To get to the lemma, we take off the ending and the variable vowel and replace them with an omega, or perhaps a me, and what we find is nestuo. Now try our second word. Here the ending is sin, and that sin ending shows up in 3 places in the core pattern. Remember that it shows up in the third singular active and the third plural active in 2 different forms. So which one is this? Well, here it's the third singular active for the me verbs, and that's distinguished from the third plural actives, as you saw, because they have usin or asin. Notice also that this is a compound verb with the preposition epi on the front. So our stem is tau iota theta eta, and that points us to tithemi. And in the compound form we have epitithemi. Now try this word. Here we have the 0 form of the third singular active, and the accent points to a contract verb. The lemma is martireo. Now actually there are 2 places the 0 form shows up in the core pattern, the first singular active and the third singular active. So how did I know that that particular word was a third singular active? When the 0 form is used, and what you have left is an epsilon, or epsilon iota, then you expect that to be a third singular active. The 0 form in the first singular is used in the perfect tense form, and there the tense form sign will end in an alpha. So if you see an alpha with the 0 form, expect that to be a first singular, and if you have an epsilon or epsilon iota, then expect that to be the third singular active. What about this word? Well, here we have another sin ending, but in this case it's asin, and so we have the third plural active for the me verbs. And this is another form of tithemi. If you want more parsing practice, there are exercises available on the website for using and enjoying Biblical Greek. Here's a summary of what we've seen in this video. We're working with the primary tense forms in the indicative, and there's a core pattern, and that will provide the endings that will give us the person, number, and voice. Then we looked at the present tense form in particular. It's built on the first principal part. It covers both the active, middle, and passive, and it's composed of a stem plus a variable vowel of either omicron or epsilon, and then the primary endings. And the other thing we looked at was the core pattern of me as another one of the 12 to learn.